I popped my head out of the water and it was like a comet hit me in the face. It was like, holy smokes, there is a 0% chance I would be underwater diving right now if
Mhm.
Mark didn't ask me, what is something you would like to do more of? And so when I say conversations that create matter, he literally edited my behavior in the future, put me underwater in some direct, indirect, I don't know what the relationship is, but like I edited my future because of that simple chat that I didn't think anything of. And for me, that is such a compelling reason to freaking pay attention in conversations and to the questions that you ask, because they can, not guaranteed, but they can have a very profound effect on people.
Albert Einstein said, "Don't think about why you question, simply don't stop questioning." Welcome to Curated Questions. I am your host, Ken Woodward. And these questions are not mathematical equations, but rather a resource to encounter personal reflection and growth. As Tupac Shakur stated, even the genius asks questions. Now, let's engage the questioning community. Greetings. Ken Woodward here, and welcome back to another episode of Curated Questions. Together, we engage inquisitive humans about how they use questions to navigate and make sense of our world. I'm a fellow traveler and pilgrim on this journey, and I'm glad you're here. Today's conversation is with Chad Littlefield. Chad is the co-founder and chief experience officer of We and Me. The website is and.me, which is a clever use of the domain extension. The organization aims to help leaders, educators, and events make connection easy. The successful 2015 Kickstarter for We Connect cards create conversations that matter, which is comprised of cards with questions on the front and a stretch on the back intended to make conversations fun and meaningful. Forbes calls Chad a, quote, global expert on asking questions that build trust and connection in teams. He is a TEDx speaker, best-selling author, and creator of Connection Toolkit, which is now being used to create conversations that matter on campuses and companies in over 80 countries worldwide. Chad and his late partner, Will Wise, launched their books, How to Make Virtual Engagement Easy and Ask Powerful Questions, Create Conversations That Matter, both #1 Amazon bestsellers. Chad's YouTube channel has over 1 million views, and he hosts the annual Connectors Summit in December to bring people together to hone their skills and meet like-minded people leading the vital work of connecting. Chad earned a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology and a Master of Education in Learning, Design, and Technology from Penn State University. The LinkedIn algorithm delivered Chad's enthusiasm into my timeline. His energy, love strategically using questions, and building connections impressed me. Chad, welcome to Curated Questions.
Thanks for having me. What a generous info. I'm going to send that to my mom.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Christmas cards are sufficient. They got the little thing that you can record. So I'd like to start off in asking, when did you first understand the power of questions?
Probably when I met my late co-founder. So the first words ever spoken to me by my late co-founder, Will Wise, I was a college student and I walked into this dialogue facilitation class that I was taking, and Will was the instructor. And I walked in, and very unlike any other class I'd taken, the chairs were arranged in a circle. There were about 20, 30 people in the class. And Will started the class by dimming the lights a little bit. He was sitting in the circle, made eye contact with everybody, and then looked out and said, "Are you ready? Are you ready for your life to change?" And then he stood up, went over, opened the door, and said, "Because if you are not, here is the door."
Wow.
And that was literally the way that I met Will. So, like, talk about intensity. And it was a very genuine invitation to make a choice to be open and receptive to the fact that something might be different when you walk out of this room at the end of the semester. So for me, basically what that class was teaching me all the skills and tools that Will and I wrote about and packaged up into Ask Powerful Questions, the book. And so for me, when I met Will and he taught me much of this for the first time, and I went back and practiced it, I felt like I re-met my own mother. I feel like I learned things about my grandmother that I would never have learned before she passed, all because as I re-entered the world, it was through this lens of curiosity and questions, and realizing that, holy smokes, it's like a very simple sentence structure, a sentence that ends in a question mark. And yet when you lob one out, it acts almost identical to a key that unlocks a door, except it's more like the custodian's key that it doesn't unlock just one door. It's like the master key that unlocks many,
Mm.
many doors for people. So you lob out a question, and to most questions, there's multiple answers, and you just don't know what you're going to get. And so it feels like playing the lottery in a very connecting, thoughtful way. That was a pretty intense origin, but that was the origin or the awareness of the power of questions for me.
And did it impact other students the same way? Not that you built businesses together, but that intentionality just, yeah, like you say, seems intense.
Yeah,
But
very
then over
intense.
the course of this class, how did it impact the other students?
There was a little bit more context, right? So I didn't just like randomly select the class out of a course roster. It was a tier 2 class. After going through an introduction, it was a part of this organization that I worked for 5 or 10 years called World in Conversation. And the people who took this course then became trained facilitators for World in Conversation, leading dialogues with military cadets who were going to be deployed to, let's say, Afghanistan, and leading dialogues with 4 of them here, and then 4 Afghan civilians on a screen. And
Yeah.
like before virtual meetings were overly popular, leading these conversations. So the whole idea of World in Conversation was to bring people with very different perspectives to sit in a circle and talk about stuff you typically never talk about, like long-term conflict, race relations, politics, etc., for 90 minutes, with the intention of skipping headlines and actually just meeting another person and seeing what happens. So how did it affect other students? It was polarizing. something that intense is always going to be polarizing. So for some people, it was like opened up and receptive. I don't think anybody walked out then, but there were definitely people who formed opinions about Will then, like, who is this guy?
Mm.
And yeah, it like brought up more questions, which is why I've always said, like, I don't start my classes like that. I don't have as much conviction as Will did.
I'm just thinking next time I get like family reunion, I think that's,
Mhm. So
but
this is like maybe a fun thing to unpack with questions. You could take, in my humble opinion, you could take any question, whether it is a deep, big question or a light, simple, small talky kind of question,
Mhm.
and they would be received completely differently based on how you've communicated your intent in asking the question. So, exhibit A, you walk up to a bus stop,
Yeah.
sit down next to a stranger. Hi, what is life teaching you right now? It's like, that is very unlikely to build a relationship of trust in that moment. But I can't guarantee this is going to build a relationship of trust. But if I sat down and I said, hey, I know this is kind of odd because bus stops are like the place where you just don't really talk to people, but I'm doing this kind of study of questions right now, and I'm really curious if you're open to answering kind of a big question. It's like that, you're sharing an intent,
Yep.
seeking some consent, and then asking a question. Those are two totally different scenarios, but the same question may land very differently. So similarly, I think Will had some context and some embedded intention on his side, but before he asked that, are you ready for your life to change?
Absolutely. Yeah. To your point on intention with questions,
Mm-hmm.
I completely agree in that I've made the opportunities to talk with absolute strangers. But to your point, if your intention is not to do harm, but to do connection or to really meet people where they at, and really truly curiosity, those conversations can go deep quick.
Very
Like,
quick. Yeah.
and it's like, I, I didn't necessarily intend to get a whole life story out of this seemingly random encounter. And I've learned to embrace the serendipity that comes with these, because inevitably, if you're open and curious and you meet someone just in passing, you can quickly have a longer conversation. And really, it happened to me over this weekend. Just from that intent of of being willing to also just be present as well and to listen.
The way we write about intention, or the impact that we pair with intention, is this statement: I am willing to know you.
Mm.
I think it's the difference for me. And I had a big lesson on this recently, or I had my punch in the gut on this recently. But I think it's the difference between doing connection versus being connected. So I can do all the same behavior. So I was in an airport recently. I- I've in my work, I've flown a lot.
Mm.
And so I've been in lots of airports and I've been in lots of airplanes. And over the last like few years, I somehow fell into this doing connection where I'd be scanning a boarding pass and I'd say something that might like put a smile on the face of the person scanning boarding passes, kind of like robotically.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I'd just be there like, happy Tuesday. But I was doing connection and it was fine. There was nothing particularly horrible about it. But this last trip, coming back from La Jolla, I was really tuned in to being connected and sitting in that intention, living in that intention of I am actually willing to know you, which for me does not mean we're going to have a long, deep, it doesn't have anything to do with time.
Okay.
Being connected can be instantaneous. And for me, the evidence was scanning boarding pass. I said the exact same words, Happy Tuesday. But the way that I was being in that moment, her head snapped up, her jaw dropped, and she just made like really deep eye contact with me and just said, "Thank you."
Mm.
Right? I had said something like that to 40 other flight attendants in the past year, but for some reason, not for some reason, because I actually shifted the orientation and the being and the intention in that moment, it had a completely different impact. So the same is true when you're asking a question to somebody at a bus stop or anything else. Is like, are you checking a box? Are you doing this out of social obligation? Or do you actually care? Are you interested? Do you have and is your intent other centric as opposed to me
Mm.
centric?
That's a helpful distinction. Now, you did mention when you were talking what set you up to get you into that class
Mhm.
that you had done this facilitation. So, where do you trace your roots back? How far back does this, some variation of what you'd consider connection? How did you get into this business or into this world? It seems like you've been doing this for quite a little while.
I trace my origins back to as far as the place where I was half the height that I am now. So not a baby, but I don't know.
Okay.
It's like, say 10, 12 years old, saw the movie Patch Adams with Robin Williams for the first time.
Yes.
And I had my whole entire life figured out. So, in the movie, Robin Williams, Patch, became a doctor to really promote the quality of life over quantity. And he really found a way of healing people through human connection and used humor as a big way to do that. But, just was able to walk into a terminally ill patient's room. And like in no medical textbook would you find this, but Patch walks in, he looks at this guy who is dying. No clinicians can get this guy to eat. He's throwing bedpans at nurses. And Patch walks in, he looks him dead in the eye and says, kick the bucket, push the daisies, and just fires out a handful of idioms about around death.
Mm.
And after about the fourth one, this guy opens up and fires one back at him. And it was like everybody else was like, be positive, do this, you got to eat. And he's like, no, where would I be at? If I was like a grumpy, terminally ill patient at this moment, I'd be right here. And so he just met them right there. And so, anyway, to make a long story long, I saw that movie and had my whole life figured out. I was going to be Patch, going study medicine. I was going to be a doctor,
Okay.
and then one chemistry class in college. I was like, okay, this party's not happening for the next 10 years, but I'm still interested in being a version of Patch Adams. And so I found my way down psychology and social psychology, interpersonal psychology, and tried to basically answer the question, was that Hollywood, or can connection actually heal people in some way and mend relationships, even extending to physical ailments? And so that's what I spent all my time studying, figuring out. And the origin into like more we and me in this work, because of some work that I was doing in college, really passionate about, connected to this idea of taking positive social risks. I started a student organization, and my senior year of college was invited to give a TEDx talk. And after that TEDx talk, a short little talk on positive social risks. And after that talk, I walked off stage and somebody said, "Oh, that was amazing. My company is having this retreat 3 months from now. How much do you charge to speak?" And I'm like, they don't know I'm a senior in college, but I do. And I'm like, how
Billions,
much do I charge?
billions.
Yeah. It's like, so I charged a whopping, crazy, outlandish $500 to drive all the way to Delaware, deliver this 2 hour workshop for a company. It's like laughable when I think back on it, but that was also the seed of like, how much do you charge for this? That was the question
Mm,
that kind of turned on my brain to the fact that like, oh, this is a thing. I get
yeah,
paid to unpack my ideas with people. That's really interesting.
that is
Yeah.
cool. And here we are.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
here we are unpacking ideas for free.
Exactly. I do want to give an opportunity up front here to give space and to pay tribute to your co-founder, Will Wise. As I was telling you before we started recording, I was touched and impacted by the tribute that you have on your website, and we'll put links, and I would encourage folks to go read it because it is impactful. How did Will view questions? Did he have any unique perspectives
Mm.
on questions or how they might be used or how he used them?
Yeah, I can answer that in a couple ways. His origin story into connection and questions was really from a place of being very awkward and finding it very difficult to connect. And so with people when he was younger, and feeling like he kind of wore an invisibility cloak and traveled through and remained unseen by people until he met this guy, this Amish guy on a bus who I don't remember the exact story and questions, and I wouldn't do it justice to really tell it, but Will wrote it down in Ask Powerful. It's one of the openings of Ask Powerful Questions. And basically, it was the first time that Will felt seen. And this guy had asked and really inquired about Will being adopted. And he's like, Will's like, how do you even see me right now? I thought I was just this
Wow.
anonymous person
Right.
on a bus. And I don't know exactly, I wasn't there, but so I don't know all that. So I don't want to steal that story. But for Will, that was an aha. And then the second thing, and so all the tools and the things that we unpack and I continue to teach and share with people around how to ask powerful questions all stemmed from Will's desire to figure out some repeatable like system to make this otherwise mysterious connection thing happen. Like
Mm.
it's a very mysterious, ethereal, not super tangible thing, and so his brain was like, "What do I do?" And so it came from a very mechanical place. So that's one. The other one, I don't remember the exact language, but when we were arguing over the subtitle of the book, he had something that I felt like was extremely not marketable. And so we changed it. But it was something like revealing the world unseen or something like that. Revealing, it spoke to like all the unknown that surrounds us
Yeah.
and questions ability to color those otherwise shadowed dark areas that are blind spots in our own vision. And so the idea, right, of um, next time you go pick up food or you're checking out at the grocery store and the cashier's standing there and you have a little like maybe it's just a thanks or a little nothing, like a question. Like they have an entire life, they've been alive
Yeah.
for at least 18 years or so if they're working at a grocery store, and they have an entire life, and a single sentence that ends in a question mark unlocks a little piece of that story. And for both of us, it was like revealing that unknown turned an otherwise two-dimensional person or even a two-dimensional idea and makes it 3D. Now all of a sudden, if somebody cuts you off on the highway and you had the chance to ask the question, what's going on right now for you? And they answered that question, I can almost assure you that 90+% of people would be less angry, less
Yeah.
frustrated, less likely to flip the person off if they
Yeah.
knew the answer to that question from every person that cut them off from now until always. The last thing I'll share is the book is not titled Ask Great Questions, Ask Good Questions, Ask Nice Questions. It is Ask Powerful Questions. And the reason we landed on that word is that when you ask a question to someone, it gives them the choice, autonomy, and power to share a piece of their story
Mm.
or not. There's an irrational fear of asking questions that we typically don't. It comes from like, well, I can't ask somebody at a bus stop, what is life teaching me right now? Which, to be fair, I don't recommend that strategy. But we forget, for me, one of my favorite features of questions is that when a question is asked of somebody, the answerer always has 100% choice and autonomy in how they answer that question. And if you ask me, what is one thing life is teaching you right now? I could say, my office is a little cold. I could kind of go with a sweater right now. And that would be true, not
Yeah.
particularly vulnerable or revealing, but true. I could also say, oof, life is teaching me what I mentioned earlier, to stop doing connection and start focusing all my attention on being connected with folks. And that's a much more philosophical, deep,
Right.
possibly conversation starting answer than it's cold.
Yeah. In talking with Seth Godin here recently, we were talking about how the question just creates a tension, right? So you've got some tension by asking a question, and then there's this play, just as you're saying, on how am I going to relieve that tension? I can either
Mm.
blow it off or start in that dialogue. And we start going back and forth and to play with that, relieving and tightening that tension. Uh,
I appreciate that. I think some of the tension too is that, take like a meeting context, for example. Our world is pretty heavily designed for consumption rather than contribution.
yes.
And so some of the tension is created as like, there's not a lot of them, but there's a few movies that really break the fourth wall in a way that like character turns from movie and they're outside of the context of the movie and they're speaking to the audience.
Yeah.
And I think questions break the fourth wall, especially in group settings. And so in a meeting where that might be structured in a let's go around and do report outs, or leaders taking up 90% of the airtime, sharing what's going on, starting out with a question. And for me, I would call this in a author, hero, and mentor of mine, Peter Block, would call it connection before content.
Hmm.
And it's the idea of like, if you start off a meeting with a question that connects people, allows people to connect to each other and to the purpose of why you're there, a whole bunch of tension is broken. One, because, and the idea is like getting people into small groups of 3 to have those conversations. It totally leaves the land of consumption and invites people into the land of contribution, where they're no longer just sitting there being a critic or consumer or judging what's happening. They are now participating in it, and they are responsible for the future that they're actively creating right now as they're speaking. That's a little bit
Hmm.
heady, so let me say that in
Yeah.
a slightly different way. When people are just passively taking in something in their environment, the world is happening to them much more. But
Right.
when you've asked them a question and they're sharing their perspective, what I've learned is that, and Will actually misspoke, the subtitle that we landed on was Create Conversations That Matter. He had dyslexia, and we were co-giving a keynote together one time, and he misspoke the subtitle and said Conversations That Create Matter. And I just brushed it off as Will's dyslexia for 5 years. And just recently, in the last couple of years, I realized, holy smokes, this is what it's all about. It's conversations actually that edit the future. Questions
Wow.
are an edit button for what happens next. And I mean that very literally. So in 30 seconds or so, I'm going to stop talking, Ken.
Mm-hmm.
And it's possible you're going to say something or ask another question. And that question will literally edit the words that come out of my mouth next. And so you will edit the future with the question that you ask. You will create matter in that way. The transcript, the social media shortcut, whatever gets generated out of this
Right.
will be different because of what you've asked. But taking that a step further, I had a mentor whose claim to fame is he helped Simon Sinek find his why. His name is Mark Levy. And Mark asked me just casually, I worked with Mark for a year, and he's kind of pushing my thinking, trying to help me hone in on what he calls it the next big sexy idea.
Mm. Okay.
And he just casually asked me one of the We Connect card questions, this card deck that I created. And he asked me, what is something you would like to do more of? Just like a little connection before content before we jumped into our chat for that day. And my answer was scuba diving. And I unpacked that a little bit. And I grew up scuba diving for lobster as a kid, hadn't gone in several years.
Okay.
Got young kids now, keeps getting brushed off, but I love being underwater. So I did not think about that question, that conversation really at all. It was just like a small little chat. 8 months after Mark asked me that question, I was giving a keynote in Florida, and I flew down a day early to go hunting for shark teeth, scuba diving on a trip. And I popped my head out of the water, and it was like a comet hit me in the face. It was like, holy smokes, there is a 0% chance I would be underwater diving right now if
Mm.
Mark didn't ask me, what is something you would like to do more of? And so when I say conversations that create matter, he literally edited my behavior in the future, put me underwater in some direct, indirect, I don't know what the relationship is, but like I edited my future because of that simple chat that I didn't think anything of. And for me, that is such a compelling reason to freaking pay attention in conversations and to the questions that you ask, because they can, not guaranteed, but they can have a very profound effect on people.
Yes. So I'm intentionally leaving the nice big space there
Mm.
because to unpack that, or if you follow all the tendrils and just see this as a reminder of how our relationships and our conversations, just in these day to day interactions we have, really can change the future. And,
You have a pretty
real,
recent personal example. I don't know if you want to unpack all the details or not, but we had about a week ago, we had an 8-minute conversation. And there were
yeah,
several other variables there. And I don't want to push any of this, but like that edited your future quite a bit.
yeah, yeah. And so, uh, well, to fill in some of that, right?
Yeah.
I'm just made the decision over the last couple of weeks to take the government's offer and resign from the position that I've had working with the Navy as a civil servant. And this will wrap up 32 and a half years of working with the Navy in some capacity or another. And Chad was one of the folks that I reached out to, and we had just a brief interaction. But in that brief interaction, he also just gave me confidence because he was one that I was reaching out to say, hey, in my future, is this possible? And so I was talking with different people that would represent different segments of my life. And so in connecting with Chad in that conversation, it was, yeah, this is a viable direction. And here we are. I think that this is going to come out the week that that becomes into an effect, or
Mm.
at the end of February in 2025, I will wrap up all this official time with the Navy. So big changes are ahead, but these interactions are changing the future. And that recognition that indeed how we use language, how we use intentionality, how we use connection, you can make a difference.
Quite a large difference. There's some people that I'm hang out with that would say that actually our entire world is created in our speaking and our listening. Maybe with the exception of some natural disaster kind of things, like I don't know that we cause hurricanes with our
Mm.
words, but like most of our human existence, most of the stories we repeat and either praise ourselves with or torture ourselves with are all created through speaking and our listening that happens in between our two ears or outside of our mouth. And for me, what I'm most curious about right now, or what I'm still distinguishing, because I certainly have not figured out all of this science of, okay, how do exactly our words shape and edit the future? But what I think is particularly fascinating to me is most people, if I gave you the task to sit in a coffee shop listening to calm instrumental music for 2 hours and map out the story of your life based on plotting conversations that you had that kind of nudged you in a particular direction as you went along, right? Most people would be able to point to a conversation they had with a teacher that illuminated this career existed, or like you could plot, most people could plot most of their journey, trace it back to a handful of conversations. The thing is, in hindsight, you can do that and it all makes sense. It's like, oh, yeah, yeah, this led me to
Yeah.
this, and this person introduced me to this book, and this person introduced me to this person, and they gave me this job. But in the moment, you have no clue that your future is being edited. And so, what I feel really passionate about right now is I think one of the largest ingredients to whether a conversation shapes or edits your future really materially or significantly or not is how you're holding and treating that conversation in your mind and in your being, right? So if I'm going into this like I don't even know why I booked this meeting on my calendar. This is like a waste of time. I shouldn't have said yes to this. Then I can almost guarantee you it's probably not going to be a life-changing conversation.
Yeah.
But if you're going into that conversation saying, I can't guarantee it, I'm not going to be expectant of outcome, but I'm going to be awfully open and interested to the fact that this might be the conversation that I reflect back on 10 years from now and say, holy crap, if I didn't have that chat, the last 10 years would be totally different. And if we just hold, and lightly, right? It's not entering every
Hmm.
conversation with like this severity, like, oh my God, this could be life changing. It's just lightly reminding yourself
Yeah.
that this might be a really important connection right now. And I have the power to shape it with the questions that I ask and how I answer the questions that I'm asked.
As you think about that, are you looking at your schedule and thinking that, or are you carrying this into the conversation with the folks at the coffee shop? How are you living this?
Yeah, one very practical way that it exploded on LinkedIn recently that I was a bit surprised at is one of the gifts that Will left me when he died, just through the way that he lived and operated, was the what I now call the no catch up on your calendar rule. Catch up with a K. So no catch up on your calendar. And the idea is do a survey of all the meetings and gatherings you have on your calendar. How many times have you reached out or been reached out to and say, oh, let's catch up or let's reconnect or, oh, let's just have coffee or, oh, can I pick your brain or any of those conversations?
Yeah.
Will would say, no. It's not that I am saying no to the meeting altogether, but it's saying no to having conversations without any intention.
Okay.
And so one very material way, if you go to book in on my calendar, it'll say, what's your name, email, time, you want to meet on Zoom, blah, 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 blah. And then it'll ask one question. What is your intention with our time together? If you cannot, or if they cannot answer that question, then that meeting should not exist on your calendar. Now, some people flared up and reacted, oh, this is way too transactional. This is not, sometimes you just gotta like, what about spontaneity and serendipity and yada yada. It's like, no, I don't think you understand. Being intentional, sharing an intention, it's not a selfish intention that you want to get out. It's a
Hmm.
mutually beneficial, something that includes the needs of the whole, whoever's there, and helps pull people together. The Latin root of the word intent actually means to stretch or stretching. And so I think about a
Okay.
good
Yeah.
intention like a rubber band,
Yeah.
where, okay, so Ken, we're recording this podcast. A goal or an objective would be I want people to find out about my stuff and watch YouTube videos and learn more about how to ask powerful questions. And that's a like fairly me-centered goal. The way that I would stretch that into an intention is I'd love for people to find out about my work, perhaps pick up and read the book so that, and this is how you stretch a goal to an intention. You add two words to the end of it, so that, and then you fill in a currency that they care about. And
Hmm.
so I'd love for people to discover all this work so that every conversation that they have from the moment they're done listening to this podcast and onward is just 20% more intentional, more useful, more aligned with the kind of way they want to spend their time. That's not very transactional. That's a very other centric way of thinking
Right.
about that. So yeah, to your question of how I'm practicing it, it's like asking that one question on repeat over and over again. And the thing is, like, I'll say yes to many, many meetings as long as the intent is worth 30 minutes or worth 60 minutes
Yeah.
to both of us.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to waste anybody's time. Yeah,
Yep. That that makes perfect sense. Hmm.
there you go.
So now, what do you think that we often get wrong about connection?
I think that the way that word is often used or seen is sometimes when it's paired with the idea of networking or building your network. For me, that is quite transactional. And the idea of connecting as a means to an end. So Will used to say efficiency is the enemy of connection. And I'm only like just now learning this lesson. He said it and I've repeated it many times, but literally just in the last 2 weeks, I finally got it. It's like, oh, right. for for the last several years, as my own practice has grown, as the email is like, there's lots more coming through my inbox. And so I developed this habit of being highly efficient in the way that I quote connected with people. And what I realized I was doing was I was doing connection. I was following the behaviors of connection,
Mm-hmm.
but I skipped the step of I am willing to know you. I skipped the step of intention and actually being connected with them. And so I think for me that the difference is that like I'm connecting with someone as a means to eventually get a promotion versus I'm connecting with you because I actually just care about what's going on in your life right now, what you're working on, how I might be able to be supportive, etc. And there's I think for me it's not ignoring the fact that connections have major benefits. It's not ignoring the fact that 80% of jobs are never posted. They're
Mm.
just traded through connections and nepotism, if you will.
Yeah.
It's not ignoring that fact, but it's coming back to a more altruistic intent and root. And I think that altruistic intent and root, ironically, is a much more useful way to connect with people. Whereas you can feel when somebody is connecting with you as a means to an end. And so the short answer to your question, what do people usually get wrong about connection, is thinking that it is something that is useful to you as
Mm.
opposed to reframing it. So that shifting the focus from it's all about me to it's actually about we. It's actually about others in the group. And as someone who's built a career, half their career off of professionally speaking and traveling around and talking to large groups of people, I get remarkably nervous before every single event. And the only thing I've discovered to reduce my heart rate before I speak is to recognize and regain the awareness and remember the fact that I'm nervous because I'm thinking about myself and what people will think of me. And it's very self focused. And as soon as I say, actually, I don't give a hoot what people think about me, I'm so interested in being as useful as possible
Yeah.
to this audience for the hour that I've got them. Nerves don't go away, but they like get cranked down by about half.
How do I merge that with the reality that I reached out to you on LinkedIn, right? And there was,
Yep.
so I want to call out my hypocrisy where there's hypocrisy in this and fully
Yeah.
own it, right? How would you see moving forward with, because I can tell you this conversation will make a difference, as we talked about,
Hmm.
the next time that I'm hovering over the connect button, right? Or whatever it is on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
So how does that now look? What do you think um, is the most caring way, maybe to say, that practice of reaching out
So let's play with
in
this. Let's
network
actually
or,
do it reverse. So you reached out to me and
yeah,
invited me to jump on the podcast. But let's say it was the other way around. Let's say I discovered curated questions
yep,
and your work and listened to Seth Godin's interview or listened to Derek Sivers' interview and was like, oh, like Ken's got something awesome going on here. I would love to be on that podcast.
yep,
And so oftentimes connection might start with a me centric like objective or goal. Like I would
hmm,
love to get on that podcast.
yep,
2 words. So when you hit the connect button on LinkedIn, I would love to be on your podcast, and or I'd reframe it a little bit differently, but I would love to be on your podcast so that,
mm,
and fill in a currency that you might care about. And that's going to require some empathy with what does Ken actually care about. And so if I were to reach out and invite myself onto your podcast, I might have said, Ken, I saw the Curated Questions podcast. I listened to the first 10 minutes of Seth's interview, and I listened to all of Derek's interview, and I was so struck by how intentional and well prepared the podcast was. I've spent my entire life's work thinking about questions. I would love to have a conversation with you. And I think that I could offer something really unique to your listeners. And based on the way that I've seen you interview people, I would also love to send out your podcast to my email list of 50,000 connectors, 50,000 people who are all kind of passionate, interested
yeah,
in this. And so for you, growing a podcast, it's like, oh, all right. Chad's going to send out my newsletter to 50,000 people. He's done his homework. Like, so you see how that intention is like,
okay,
it's very transparent. So what Will would say about intent, right? when the power of being clear about intent is when you are clear about an intention with somebody else, it leaves no room for manipulation. Manipulation has to pack its bags and get out of here, because now I know the game that you're playing, and I have the full autonomy and choice to say, yes, I want to play that game, or no, I do not want to play that game.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, all of that said, there's heaps of art and nuance to that. You were talking about a LinkedIn message, like that might be a lot for a first chat. So I might start off a little, like, I have some emotional social intelligence. If I really wanted to be on your podcast, I might reach out and say, oh my goodness, I just discovered the Curated Questions podcast. This is absolutely amazing. I'm curious if you have an episode or a link to like your inspiration or story for starting the podcast. I'd love to know how this became a thing. And so, in other words, I think that one beautiful embedded implicit intention is natural, genuine curiosity. So an exercise that I would do, I don't work with college students very much anymore, but once or twice a year, I like to do something with college students to keep me in touch with what they're thinking about. And I was working with a group recently. I had them do the exercise of go to somebody's LinkedIn profile that you would love to connect with. Scroll through the profile, and your job is to, on a piece of paper, write down 3 things that you are naturally, genuinely curious about. Okay, so they went to the school, they did
Yep.
this was a bullet in one of their jobs. Now take that thing and turn it into a question and send them that question, right? If you want to connect with folks, like that is a very generous way. Whereas if you look at my LinkedIn inbox, it's just flooded with people trying to sell me crap.
Yeah.
It's like there is no genuine curiosity there.
That's helpful.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And for you, so leaving the Department of Defense and starting your own practice for the very first time, you have 32 and a half years of amazing experience, wisdom, etc. Now it's about playing the game that we talked about of becoming known for knowing something. And that will involve a lot of connections. So when I first started my practice, nobody knew what I was up to. And so I sent a lot of messages outbound, and a lot of them, like I would get a newsletter, like a spam newsletter from some conference that I don't even know how I got on their newsletter. But I would reply to the newsletter and just say, this is really interesting what you're doing about mentoring. I'm curious if you've ever considered doing an interactive exercise like this. And I'd include a link to this question swap that I would do with WeConnect cards.
Right.
That question, in response to a spam newsletter, turned into 5 paid speaking engagements with the University of New Mexico Mentoring Institute that happens in Albuquerque every year, which led to an engagement with the CIA, because somebody who attended was there from Langley and was like, this was awesome. I want to bring you in and have you speak with all of our folks. It's like, that came from a response to a spam newsletter. So for me, this is the power of connection, but I had no thought or really even deep expectance, or I just had no expectation at all that would lead to anything. And yet it was quite transformative in a lot of ways.
On this podcast, if folks scroll back through the guests that have been here, I would submit that I'm punching above my weight with folks like yourself and the other folks that are up and coming, just from the standpoint that the invites that I do are intentional. There is thought that I put into these, right? What I'm going after when I'm reaching out to potential guests is that I don't think that this conversation about questions comes up very often. And if you're living and breathing questions in your daily life, whatever it is, I think that this is an unmet need. And so I think that this is why, like when Nikki Giovanni said yes, we had a conversation for 2 hours. And halfway through, she said, I don't ask questions. And my family gives me grief because I don't ask questions. And she says multiple times, I wanted to have this conversation. So I'm like, I don't understand. And after she passed, I was having a conversation with her wife. And I asked, I was like, this doesn't make any sense to me. And she's just like, it's just the way that Nikki was. She'd be having a conversation and someone would say, oh yeah, we're getting a divorce. And she would ask no follow-up questions. Her view was, if they want me to know, then they'll tell me. And so I'm just like, How does all of this happen? But yeah, but coming back to just being genuine,
Mm,
and I think what I'm offering in this podcast or what I'm going forward is I'm holding out this offer to have a unique conversation that you probably have not had before.
mm.
And so that I think is probably my biggest carrot that I offer.
Natural, genuine curiosity. Let me repeat that. Natural,
Mm.
genuine curiosity allows you to punch above your weight class in so many areas and domains in life. And so for sure that earned you my attention. Well, I mean, the alignment of curated
Mm.
questions, and you piqued my curiosity,
Yeah.
but your natural curiosity and the way that you reach out piqued. And then also I'll tag in social proof that I shot Derek Sivers a quick email and said, "How was Ken?" And he said, "Awesome."
Nice. Love it. Yes.
And so, right, because you, Derek Sivers, who wrote the book Hell Yeah or No.
Yeah.
When I am doing a podcast, I want to be a hell yeah or a no. And the way that you set it up, and I think what you're building, what you're creating was an easy hell yeah. And here's a little cocktail party stat around questions that
Mm.
you can repeat as far as that you're noticing or observation that there's a gap in this kind of question space. So when me and Will were writing Ask Powerful Questions, we did some research on just how many questions people ask. And so kids between the ages of 3 and 5 on a daily basis, any guesses to how many questions kids ask?
I saw it in the book, but
Oh,
I don't remember. I think it was like 400 or something like that.
yep. On average, 300 to 400 questions per day between the ages of 3 and 5 per day. Adults, 6 to 12
Yeah.
questions per day. And if your life is anything like mine, half of those questions for me are like a text to my wife, like, when do you need me home? What should we eat tonight? Want me to pick up subs? They're not questions that are like building relationships of trust or expanding
Yeah.
creativity or um, you're creating connection. They're pretty logistical questions. And so that makes sense to some degree, right? Because we're asking all those questions when we're kids to figure out the world. But tanking down to 6 to 12, the reason I think that's interesting is I don't feel like I've met a single person on the planet, definitely myself included, who knows more than 1% of what there is to know
Mm.
about life, world, universe, etc. So why have we stopped asking? Why do we ask so few questions if we know so little about most things? And I think there are a lot of reasons, but the point is, for me, it's just shining a flashlight on that dynamic.
Yeah.
And I've learned one of the most practical tools to offer people along with that awareness is just what I call the magic of a second question. And so for Nikki Giovanni, I would love to be able to say to Nikki Giovanni, I'm so curious how your conversations would shift if you just tapped into the magic of a second question. I had a kind of teacher, mentor in high school, Eric Tyler, and he would say, "How are you?" And I'd say, "Good," or "Fine," or
Mm.
whatever else. And he'd say, "What's good about it? What's fine about it?" So just that second question took a mindless greeting and
Yeah.
turned it into an actual thoughtful conversation where I had to create new neural pathways to actually think, well, shoot, I just said good. What is actually good about it?
So
Right.
did I lie or not?
Yeah.
Right. It came out of my mouth. So yes, I need to come up with something. Yeah. I
But it's like a
acknowledge that.
light switch. Questions flip on people's brains. They like jump people up into their prefrontal cortex and they're like, oh, you mean I can't just repeat things that I can't just like plug in the cassette when you
Mm.
ask me, what do I do? And just let the tape play out and say what I've said to the last 200 people. When you're asked a new question that's rooted in somebody's genuine curiosity that isn't one of the 5 kind of rut questions that we ask on repeat as we're meeting people, it literally lights up people's brain, makes them think. And this is one of the filters for me of the 60 questions in the We Connect cards deck was, have you ever been asked this question before? And for
Mm.
most people, out of the 60, they'll say at least 50 of the questions, they've never actually been asked that question by anyone in their life. And so it's a little deck that just flips on people's brains.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's touch on that a second then.
Okay.
How did you come up with that list?
um, The rapid prototype way was I was leading adventure trips in grad school for teenagers. So I'd take them mountain biking, caving, rock climbing, and the first half day of this week-long adventure program was, quote, team building.
Okay.
And getting two teenagers to connect with each other is an awfully awkward thing to watch. Like they don't know what to do with their hands. And so I was in grad school for learning design, and I just was asking myself, like, kind of the design thinking method. I was like, what could I just put in between these two people and make that go better? And so I went up to one of my professors for this design studio course, and I said, I know you have this whole syllabus mapped out, but what about I don't know what it's going to be yet. I'm going to go through the design thinking process, create some
Mhm.
tool
Okay.
to help this go better, learning tool that can be used in a variety of contexts. And I ended up writing my master's thesis and publishing an academic paper on the creation of what became We Connect cards and ways to filter the questions, et cetera. And so one of the, as an example, there's a whole academic paper on it, so I'm not going to go too deep. But one of the things that I did with a dozen groups was I gave different iterations of the
Okay.
set of questions in the deck to groups of people, and I laid out a green, yellow, and red piece of paper. And I said, as a group, would you just go through and put all the questions that you're like, oh, that's a really good question, and put that in the green pile. And the ones that you're like, kind of interesting, maybe need some tweaking, put that in the yellow pile. And then red questions, you're like, ugh, don't ask me this. I could take this out of the deck, put those in the red pile. And I just kept doing that until almost all the questions were landing in green. There were maybe a few in yellow, and you can't make everybody happy. So there's some questions that are always in the red.
Yeah. Fair enough.
um, so that was one way of filtering out that set. And then I think the insight that, wow, people have not been asked this question before came when I started facilitating. And I gave the exercise of lay out the 60 questions and just remove every question that you've already been asked. And I just noticed like there weren't a lot of questions getting removed in doing that. And I would do it with groups as well, like remove all the questions that you feel like you could probably answer for at least a few other people in the group. And I still, doing that exercise, I've still never had anybody remove more than 6 questions out of the 60.
Wow.
Which means that to talk about blind spot, there's 54 questions. And the first group I did that with was a group of 6 HR professionals that had worked together for a minimum of 5 years, some of them up to 20 years. And they couldn't remove more than 6 questions, which means that 54 of the questions, they'd been working side by side 40 hours a week for 5 to 20 years. And they had no clue any of the answers to these 54 questions of this person. And I've repeated that dozens of times since, and with the
Wow.
same result.
Any idea if that's different for different countries, if it's just an American thing?
I am American, and I have definitely learned. So there's all sorts of nuance. I've got young kids. I turn down nearly every international speaking opportunity just to remain with families. Maybe an important feature of questions is the ability to say, I don't know. So here's me saying, I don't know.
Gotcha.
I don't
Yeah.
know all the difference, but for sure, there's tons of cultural implications, right? But yeah, questions have very different connotations depending on how you grew up and whether you were taught to remain silent and listen and keep your place in
Right.
society or in that gathering, or whether Americans tend to be a little bit more verbose and loud and uh, offering.
Let's jump to what I call the right now question. So, this is a newer thing that I've been doing in asking people, what questions are you working with right now? So, this is something different than what am I going to have for lunch and am I going to get married or the big questions like that. But this is more like, what are the question or questions that you're working with on a daily basis right now?
Okay. I have 2 responses. One is probably more along the lines of the answer because the second question is probably a little bit bigger, but I think
Hmm,
it's extremely valuable. So I want to share it.
I
Anyway, and
love them
it's what I'm
both.
currently really internally dwelling on, focusing on.
Yeah.
So the first one, just day to day, I've really been loving the question meeting, jumping on a call with a client and just saying, hey, curious as a way to connect before content, what's taking up lots of your brain space right now? And it's a pretty safe way to teleport into something immediately relevant and important to somebody else,
Hmm.
right? So it's like, what's taking up lots of your brain space right now? Many things take up people's brain space. And so people get to pick, how honest do I want to be? How vulnerable do I want to be? So I love that question, because it's like it drops you right into the present. It also allows you to really meet them where they're at. And it changes the way that I have the next 60-minute conversation with them.
Hmm.
If I know, okay, this is what's on your brain, right? So I know you, Ken, are going in this transition of 32 and a half years with the Navy and Department of Defense, and now shifting into this whole new world. And so our conversations on and off record, I'm like, I have that in my mind. And especially when we're off the record, I want to be as useful and helpful as possible in that transition.
Hmm.
And knowing that that's taking up lots of your brain space is extremely helpful. And so that's like, tuck that one in your back pocket. What's taking up lots of your brain space right
Beautiful.
now?
Love it.
Deeper question, thanks to a new mentor and advisor of mine, Blake LaGrange, who's the founder of mastering.com. So he created this mixing and mastering music, created this music education company, sold it, and now just walks the beach barefoot in La Jolla, mentoring entrepreneurs. One of his gifts, as I've learned it from experiencing him last week in person for a full day in La Jolla for the first time, one of his gifts is really honing in on what he calls someone's truest value. And this is, and I might butcher it. So you have to ask him this question. But in what I took away from it, and the question that I've been holding and continue to turn over is, what is the highest amount of value that you can give to a person or a group in the shortest amount of time for the most amount of money? And for a little bit, I was uncomfortable with the money part, because I'm like, I'm an entrepreneur by accident. Like, the money is the symptom of what comes. I'm so uninterested in that. I'm so much more interested and passionate about the work that I'm doing. But I've come to learn, like, no, actually, that's really important, because money is a language, and that people express value, right?
Yep.
So people who don't have money go into $200,000 worth of debt to get a college degree that may or may not be useful to them. And so it's not that, like, we exchange our money that we have or don't have for lots of things if we perceive high enough value. And so for me, I'm really trying to answer that question. What is the highest amount of value that I can give to someone in the least amount of time for the most amount of money? And Blake's perspective and my excitement and perspective is this new focus on, for the last 10 years, for me, traveling around, working with and consulting with organizations around the world on how to ask proper questions, how to make connection easy in organization, how to create this culture of connection before content that ultimately affects and impacts performance and retention and all the rest. And it's shifting from that to actually hosting my own events and application labs in sort of a degree alternative track or program, if you will,
Hmm.
framed into this connector summit bubble. And the idea is taking and condensing what I know to be the most compelling, impactful tools, and some of which I've previewed here a little bit. It's like the difference between doing connection and being connection. If you can actually get that, if I can lead you through an experience where somebody can actually understand that,
Yeah.
it will immediately change all of their conversations that they have that week and for the rest of the year, as long as they remember and are able to come back to that. And so it's this idea of like the core focus of transformation. And so the Connector Summit that I hosted just as a test this last December was like just 2 full days of really personalized, interactive, applied learnings like this. And so it was the master's degree that doesn't currently exist in connection. And I hosted it as an experiment because I thought this might be kind of hovering around my truest value, but I didn't know. And so I stood it up and said, "Hey, I'm having a party. Anybody want to come?"
Yep.
And much to my happy surprise, 500 people showed up, and 98% of
Wow.
them said, after it was all done, said, "Holy smokes, I'm coming back next year."
Well,
And so for me,
congratulations. That is great.
that was feedback that pointed toward truest value. And so now I'm starting to think about more nuanced versions of that. So maybe that gets expanded into where there's one big annual connectors summit, but regularly or quarterly, there's a connector lab for educators, connector lab for healthcare, connector lab for government entities, so that we can have some more kind of focused niche connections and conversations in that way, but still pulling everybody together once a year for larger, potentially, teasing this, potentially in-person gathering in the future. So yeah, what is the most amount of value that you can offer someone in the shortest amount of time
Sure. Some
for the
time.
most amount of money?
Oh, that's amazing. That's a,
Yeah,
yeah,
solid question, right? Thank you, Blake.
absolutely. All credit to where it's due. Well
It's
done.
also Can I, in the spirit of us actually connecting here and knowing the journey that you're on, I would love if I can dish out self work on your own podcast. Can I
Yes,
dish out the self
please.
work to you? I would love to know your first draft answer at that question. Not now, but
Yep.
like spend a minute reflecting on it. And I'd love to know, send me back that, and that might even inform how we connect in the future too.
I have been really thinking on Seth Godin's one of his questions, and this is strategy, where he's asking, what is the change that you seek to make?
Hmm.
And I really like that. It's similar. These work together very, very well.
Hmm.
But that is, to me, is yes. What is it succinctly? What is that change that I'm seeking to make? And then I think in quick succession, going on this three question journey, I've got some weekend homework. So this is a
Yes, you
beautiful
do.
thing. I absolutely love that. Cool.
So my chief of staff, Kim, one of her greatest gifts in the form of questions is I'll share some aspirations on something that I want to do, a new card deck I want to create and launch, a connector set, whatever. And she's, it's beautiful. Like, by when would you like to have that done? And it's just the social accountability that comes along with that is so
Yeah.
powerful. And so I'm going to channel my inner Kim here and say, oh, yeah, it sounds like lovely homework. When, Ken, would you like to send me that first draft answer by?
Oh yeah. I'll have it to you by Saturday.
Can't wait to read
And
it.
we're recording on the 19th here of February. I'll get that out on Saturday. So by the time this hits the airwaves, then folks can ping me back and get that further public accountability. So I did this walk through DC, and I had said that I'm going to keep doing it and posting the Strava maps each week was that public accountability. And that helps because there's days you just don't want to go do whatever you've committed to go do. And having put, put that marker out there is a huge blessing to help the traction keep going anyway, even when we don't necessarily feel like it.
Sure.
Yeah.
I actually love that you brought up the walk and the Strava there too, because one of my favorite psych studies maybe the first psych study that I really feel like I remembered and got was, and I don't remember who the authors were of this or what journal it was published in, but they basically followed joggers, like kind of a creepy stalkerish way, and were tracking their speed. And nearly every jogger picked up their pace in downtown areas purely because of and what they alluded to was the the perception that somebody's watching me right now. I want to look good and fast and capable as a runner. But when they're like back in the neighborhood and no one's watching, is when they're like dying and practically
Oh,
walking instead of running.
absolutely. Sadly, I can relate to that
Yeah.
entirely too much.
Yeah. Yeah, but it speaks to the power of social accountability, which is another really lovely gift of questions. A question in one sentence can create that social accountability, can create that loop that is so valuable for somebody else. It's such a gift to be able to say, oh, that's an amazing idea. When would you love to have it done by?
When? Mm,
Yeah.
well, cool. Thank you. And thanks to Kim. Let's
Yeah.
see. As we start working towards wrapping up, do you have any other thoughts or encouragements about questions that we haven't necessarily explored that you were looking forward to being able to talk about as we came in?
Yeah. Ready?
Yes.
They're really easy to ask. They
Mm.
cost nothing. They take almost all good questions, take less than 10 seconds to spit out. And the final encouragement is the perceived risk of asking a question that you typically wouldn't, or a question that's out of the norm. The perceived risk is nearly always higher than the actual risk. Right. So, with the exception of, like, maybe don't ask what is life teaching you to a large man with a knife wearing a trench coat in a dark alleyway,
Yeah.
like that would be a context to steer away from. But for the most part, the highest social risk or the highest price you're going to pay is someone saying, I'm not comfortable answering that right now. That's like for the most part.
Yeah.
Now, if you're like repeatedly asking invasive questions at work that nobody wants to answer, then the risk gets increased to like you get ostracized for being the nosy person that nobody wants to talk to and everybody wants to avoid.
Yeah.
But that's in the 0.0001% of use cases of questions. And so the other thing, just coming back, I shared the stat: kids ask 300 to 400 questions, adults ask 6 to 12. I used to encourage people like, well, what if you just double your count? It's like, oh, that's actually too hard. And I've honed in now and just tapped into the magic of a second question. So it is so profound when you hear what somebody else has said. Very rarely do people, adults, respond to what somebody has said with a follow-up question in that. It's like if you start paying attention to this, it is extremely rare. What usually happens in adult conversation is what I call sentence ping pong. Sentence that ends in a period, sentence that ends in a period, sentence that
Yep.
ends in a period. And so a question is just a lovely disruptor. And it is what I've learned is like the way, once you ask that follow-up question, which means and requires you to actually listen to what somebody said. When you ask that follow-up question, it's like never is it more evident that the way that we listen has the power to change what people say. And I mean that very literally, not inspirationally or metaphorically. Like the way that you listen will literally change the words that come out of people's mouths. And so that's my final encouragement is like, you can't start lobbing out questions rooted in your natural curiosity if you're not committed to actually really hearing people's answers. And in my opinion, it's a
Mm.
prerequisite or a requirement or a responsibility when you're asking powerful questions to really hear and take in and listen to whatever they've said. And not just the facts or the words that they've said, but the music behind the words and the background and the fear and the aspiration in that answer as well.
I love that, as you say, the music behind the words. It's the first time I've heard that description because you're exactly right. There's the words, but there's the whole package, the whole symphony, if you will, right? Not just the trumpet of the words coming out, but that's a beautiful picture. Wonderful. So, where's the best place for folks to catch up with you and see what you're excited about and learn more about you?
Well, if you Google Chad Littlefield, you'll find two of us. One was murdered about 10 years ago. I'm not that one. And
I did see that today. So, yes.
yeah, so there's a Chad Littlefield involved in a high profile murder of Chris Kyle, the American sniper, that movie. Anyway,
Mm.
we and me. I chose over COVID. I had some extra time, and so I chose to start answering people's questions on YouTube. And so now to date, there's 500 plus videos on YouTube where just about any question that somebody's asked me in some way, shape, or form, you could find on YouTube. So if you listen to this podcast and you had a question like, so what's your whole story, Chad? There's a video titled "What's My Story" on Chad Littlefield's channel, and you will find that exact thing. And so that would be a lovely way to continue connecting and following up as well. And of course, I created these tools to be used in the world, and those are easily findable at weand.me.
Chad, thank you for sharing your journey and the art of connecting with the Curated Questions community. I'm grateful to have had you here.
Thank you. And I'll end with this. A mentor of mine used to say the best way to kill a question is with an answer. And so the question that I'll leave everybody with is, what is something you would like to do more of?
That'll work. To those on the other side of the speakers, thank you for being here. Chad shared strategies and tactics on how to make connections. Now it is your turn to put them into practice. The world continues to be divided. With your courage, we can be more connected. Remember to be the light to yourself and those around you. Gratitude shout out to Beauty Pill for the show's music and producer Ben Ford for the technical help. This episode was recorded on Piscataway land. Please engage with this episode in some manner. Download, follow, save, like, share, or comment about something that resonated. This action ensures we're engaging the questioning community. Until next time, keep questioning.